For millions of people in the third world, global warming is a matter of life and death. Here you're not going to find people reading articles about reducing their carbon footprints. Their carbon footprints aren't actually very big. What they're doing is fighting environmental destruction of their lives, and they're fighting the environmental destroyers on a daily basis. These fights have taken many different forms. Land occupations to block the creation of plantations devoted to agri-fuel or biofuel crops, such as soy or palm, in places like Paraguay, in Indonesia. Road blockades to demand expropriation of polluters in Ecuador. Sabotage of oil wells and pipelines in Mexico and Nigeria. Rallies and demonstrations, and all other astounding range of protests and activities going on daily. Just a month and a half ago in Peru, to explain that, let me step back. In Peru, there is a law that says the government cannot approve a mine in an area where that's got agriculture without the approval of the local farmers. Now, in fact, the Peruvian government ignores that law all the time and has given the right to create mines, and particularly in indigenous areas of Peru, where they feel all those people, you got no power anyhow, and the lands are being destroyed. In northern Peru, there's a proposal for a large-scale mine that is going to wipe out huge farming areas, and the government has refused to even hold the hearings it's supposed to hear. So what the local people did in that area was they organized their own referendum, and literally, and it was an astonishing thing. It hadn't happened before, because most of these people are very isolated. They're tiny villages way off in the mountains, and on the day of the referendum, people streamed into the towns. 60% of the people eligible showed up, almost all of them indigenous farmers, and over 90% voted against the mine. Now, we don't know if the Peruvian government's going to recognize the referendum. They denounced it as a communist plot. But nevertheless, it's indicative of the kind of ways people are organizing as anti-capitalist ecological movements in the global south. Protests like that are happening in dozens of countries, and we're going to see many more of them. Recently, we've seen something kind of new that's related to this. Most of us, I think, in this room are familiar with the mass struggles that have been going on in Latin American countries over the past few years, struggles that have led to the election of anti-imperialist governments in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua. Less noticed has been the extent to which these anti-imperialist struggles are also pro-ecology struggles, and the extent to which the leaders of the ALBA, the International Alliance that Venezuela and Cuba launched, which now involves Bolivia, Ecuador, the extent to which the leaders of the ALBA are taking the issue of global warming very seriously and incorporating ecological defense into their own programs for social and economic change. What's more, and really important about this, is the extent to which the leadership of this movement, in South America especially, is being taken by indigenous people. That indigenous people are in the front line of the fight. I quoted Evo Morales' letter to the UN a little bit earlier. And that letter, if you can, it's available at the Climate and Climate Capitalism site. If you haven't read it, you should. It's astonishing. It illustrates this point that in Latin America and the global south, the ideas of eco-socialism are part of the everyday discussion of socialists and anti-capitalists. Please read it. I was especially impressed by his suggestion for a global solution to global warming. And all these books that you read that say what we need is better light bulbs. Evo Morales says, we need to create a World Environment Organization which is binding and which can discipline the World Trade Organization, which is propelling us towards barbarism. Now, when I first read that, I thought it was sort of a clever turn of phrase, you know, a rhetorical flourish. But then you think about it, and the more politically astute that statement is. Because in that one sentence, what Morales says is that international environmental protection has to have the force of law. And it has to, and he says it has to be more important, superior to capitalist profits and the neoliberal policies that sustain them. In short, he doesn't use the phrase, but he countries calling for despotic inroads on the rights of property. It's a simple, crystal clear statement that's absolutely filled with pro-ecology and anti-imperialist content. You're going to learn an awful lot from Evo Morales. Cuba's foreign minister, Felipe Pérez Roque, also spoke to the UN on the same day on global warming, and he made a particular stress of placing responsibility for global warming directly on the imperialist countries. And he rejected any idea, as we must, that poor countries should have to forego growth in order to clean up the mess caused by the rich countries. There is something truly immoral about people in countries as wealthy as Canada, the United States, and the governments of these countries saying they won't do anything until people in poverty-stricken countries act. Until people, we've got our SUVs, you have to stop using oil. Truly an immoral position. Roque made that point very strongly, and he then went to the question of how are you going to finance mitigation and adaptation, because it isn't going to be cheap doing the cleanup and the changes. And because so much global warming is already inevitable because of what happened in the 20th century, there's going to be a lot that's going to have to be spent simply on rescuing people from the damage we cannot conceivably avoid in this century. So how are we going to pay for it? So Roque said, well, if we took half the money that the countries of the global south have to pay on servicing their debt every year, that would give us $200 billion a year for cleanup. They could use them. Well, this would not be charity. This would be people in the global south keeping their own money. Another example, he said, was let's just earmark a tenth of what the sole military superpower on the planet, the United States, spends on wars and weapons, and we would have another $50 billion a year. Let me add a footnote to that. Worldwide military spending is just over $1 trillion a year. Nicholas Stern, who did a big study for the British government on what it would cost if we acted right away to deal with global warming, he gave a cost in the realm of $620 billion. In other words, we could do it for a little over half the world's military budget. And that's a one-time cost. He was not talking about every year. That was his estimate. I think he underestimated it. But even if he got it wrong by a factor of 10, the money's there if the political will were there. Now, before I move on to an outline of some of the tasks that are facing eco-socialists in the next while, I want to point out that my emphasis on Latin America doesn't mean that there's nothing happening in the rest of the third world. I picked Latin America because I think it's very exciting and near to us. But there are major battles against ecological devastation taking place in Africa and Asia as well. I could spend hours here, by the way, just talking about the fight against the spread of industrial farms and plantations that are geared to agri-fuel, biofuel production in Central Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and elsewhere. The size and scope of the devastation that biofuel plantations are creating is astonishing. And the horrifying thing about this is that it's largely taking place because Europe and North America think they're going to solve their petroleum problems by using oil from plants. The destruction of forests to build these plantations creates more greenhouse gases than the biofuel could ever conceivably save. And it's largely taking place by the method of creating giant industrial farms and driving traditional peasants and traditional people off of their lands. The size of the plantations, I have relatives who are farmers in Canadian prairies, and they have farms that people in Ontario would think are gigantic. They have several, multiple sections. They get up into several square miles of farms with wheat and whatever on them. But here we are talking about farms that are hundreds of square miles, hundreds and hundreds in some cases, where the traditional crops have been destroyed, and they're all turned over to monocultures to grow soy or palm in order to drive the cars in North America. And there are big battles going on in many countries against that. I focused on Latin America in part because our time is limited, but above all because the formation of the ALBA bloc of anti-imperialist governments is a huge step forward for eco-socialists, and a huge step forward for the entire international left. So what are we going to do? Canadian Dimension magazine asked me to write an article on what eco-socialists should be doing now, and the issue is on the stands. My article's there. Analysis and theory and pamphlets, good things to have, but actual change is only going to come through action. Eco-socialists need to learn to ally ourselves with anyone and everyone who organizes actions that protest and expose both the corporate polluters and their parliamentary representatives. And we need to be active participants in those actions. In particular, December the 8th of this year has been declared an International Day of Protest on Global Warming. It's specifically set to coincide with the next big UN conference in Bali, which is the meeting to decide what to do when the Kyoto Treaty expires in 2012. And there are protests going on all over the world. There are people beginning to organize in Canada. It's a fairly small scale here. It's originated in England. But this is something we should be working on and building. One of the most important contributions that eco-socialists can make to the broader green movement is a clear focus on the rights of working people. The workers in the tar sands and power plants are not responsible for greenhouse gases, and they shouldn't lose one penny when their bosses are forced to clean up their acts. Sadly, the green movement has not understood this well. There's been a strong tendency to blame the people who work in those places. It's certainly, even if it's not blame, what I see again and again is I hear people saying, shut down the tar sands, with no discussion of what happens to the thousands of people who work there and who work in related industries or in stores or whatever in those areas. At the very least, a big part of the socialist involvement in this should be insisting on comprehensive retraining programs, fully subsidized relocation programs, all at full union pay, with no loss of benefits or pensions, as we begin to reorganize the economy to not produce greenhouse gases. A central feature of our work has to be publicizing pro-ecology movements in the third world, building solidarity campaigns, providing concrete aid when we can. And as a small example, Climate Capitalism is a supporter of the recently organized Lucha Indigena Solidarity Network, which is a group that raises money and other material support for Lucha Indigena. That's that newspaper, which is edited by the Peruvian socialist leader Hugo Blanco, who I quoted earlier. It's a very new project, but one I'm feeling quite optimistic about. It's the small scale, but some of the things we need to do. I started out this talk with a quote from the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. So it seems to me it's appropriate to close with Evo Morales. This is from his speech to the UN on September the 24th. I feel that it is important to organize an international movement to deal with the environment, a movement that will be above institutions, businesses, and countries that just talk about commerce, that only think about accumulating capital. We have to organize a movement that will defend life, defend humanity, and save the earth. In those words, President Morales summed up the challenge facing eco-socialists. Indeed, the challenge facing anybody who cares about our world. It isn't enough to criticize the way the world is today. We need to build a movement that can change it. And if we respond effectively, then together we can stop capitalism from making the earth uninhabitable.